This is my true story. I worked my whole life to give my son a home, a place where he and his wife could build their future without struggle. I thought kindness would be returned with respect. But one afternoon, I heard her voice from the hallway, sharp, quiet, and cold. She can't live here forever. My son said nothing. That silence was enough. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice. I just smiled. The house they stood in wasn't theirs. It was mine. And soon, they would remember that. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. She said it so casually, as if I wasn't even in the house. She can't live here forever. The words carried through the hallway, low but sharp, meant for my son but loud enough for me. I was sitting in the living room folding laundry, pretending I didn't hear, but of course I heard every syllable. The way she said she instead of your mother told me everything I needed to know. My son didn't say a word in response, not even a small defense, just silence. The kind of silence that tells you everything you don't want to believe. I kept folding the clothes, steady and quiet, because I knew reacting would only make her feel powerful. She wanted to see me flinch, to hear me beg for belonging in the very house I built. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. That night, I replayed those words in my mind. She can't live here forever. I thought about how strange it was to hear that said about me in a home that existed only because of me. I paid every mortgage payment, every tax, every repair bill. When my husband died, it was my savings that kept this roof standing. When my son lost his first job, I let him and his wife move in, rent-free, telling myself it was temporary, a few months, maybe a year. I cooked, I cleaned, I gave them privacy, and I asked for nothing but respect. But over time, they started to act like I was the guest. Her tone became colder, her patience shorter. I could feel the shift every time she walked past me without a greeting, every time she sighed when I used the kitchen, every time she rearranged things I'd owned for decades. Still, I stayed quiet. You learn as you get older that silence is its own kind of weapon. You don't need to yell when you know the truth is on your side. People who think they're in control get careless. They forget who actually holds the foundation beneath them. She believed I was too old, too soft, too dependent to do anything about it. She thought she could talk her way into ownership the same way she talked her way into my son's heart. But I've lived long enough to know that arrogance always shows itself before it falls. That evening, after they went to bed, I sat by the window with a cup of tea. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. I just felt done. There's a kind of peace that comes when you finally stop expecting decency from people who've already shown you they don't have any. I watched the porch light flicker, and in that silence, I made my decision. I wouldn't fight. I wouldn't argue. I would do what people like her never expect older women to do. I would outthink her. The next morning, she smiled at me in the kitchen like nothing happened. She asked if I wanted anything from the grocery store. I said, "No, dear. I have everything I need." And I did. I had time, proof, and ownership. The three things you need to end disrespect quietly. My son left for work without saying goodbye, the way he'd been doing for months. She hummed to herself as she packed for the trip they'd been planning. I watched her from the hallway, still pretending not to hear the tone in her voice when she told him, "I'll finally get some peace on this trip." Peace. She wanted peace. She'd get it, just not the way she imagined. I smiled politely when she said goodbye, the kind of smile that hides preparation behind kindness. She thought I was harmless. She thought age meant defeat. What she didn't know was that I was already planning the quietest, cleanest correction of her life. Some people need to be reminded where they're standing and who built the floor under their feet. The house she called theirs was never theirs. Every wall, every tile, every inch of that foundation carried my signature and my effort. I bought this house 38 years ago with my husband. We built it room by room, memory by memory, long before my son or his wife were even part of the picture. I remembered the nights we spent painting the walls ourselves because we couldn't afford professionals, the cold winters when the heater broke and we used blankets instead of complaining. It was never just a building to me. It was the sum of a life's worth of struggle and endurance. When my husband passed, this house became my anchor. I didn't have much left, but I had this roof over my head. So when my son and his wife asked to move in for a little while after his job loss, I didn't hesitate. I said yes without thinking twice. I thought I was helping family. I thought kindness still meant something. At first it was good. She was polite, overly sweet even, calling me mom every chance she got. She helped me with groceries, cooked dinner sometimes, and acted like she appreciated everything. But it didn't take long for the tone to change. It started with small things. Rolling her eyes when I gave advice, sighing when I used the laundry machine, hinting that I should go out more, like I was a guest overstaying my welcome. Then came the whispers, not loud, but sharp enough to cut. She should consider moving in with friends, I heard her say once. It's not healthy for her to depend on us. Depend on them? That part made me laugh inside. I was the one paying the property tax every year. My pension kept the electricity running. I was the one keeping the house afloat while she played homemaker in a home that wasn't hers. But arrogance is blind. She walked through my kitchen like it belonged to her. She invited her friends over and introduced it as our house. I watched her once give a tour, pointing out the living room I decorated and saying things like, "We might remodel this next year." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, watching her make plans on land she didn't own, as if speaking them out loud made them true. My son didn't correct her. He stood there quietly, smiling like he agreed. Maybe he did. Maybe in his mind this house had already shifted ownership, from his mother to his wife. But papers don't lie. And those papers had my name. Only my name. It's strange how people forget what's written in ink. They think time erases ownership, but it doesn't. A deed doesn't fade with age. I had the original copy locked in my drawer, along with the tax receipts and every legal document since 1986. I kept them all, neatly organized, waiting for the day they'd matter again. That day was coming sooner than they thought. Every time she made a snide comment, every time she acted like I was lucky to still be allowed to stay here, I grew calmer, not angrier. Anger is for people who feel powerless. I wasn't. I had everything I needed, the proof, the papers, and the patience. I'd lived long enough to know that you don't have to raise your voice when you're the one holding the pen that decides who stays and who goes. She forgot that. She forgot that kindness was a choice I'd made. And choices can change. The house she flaunted wasn't a gift. It was a loan of space, a lesson in gratitude she failed to learn. The only thing worse than an ungrateful guest is one who thinks she's the owner. She believed she could outlast me, that time would eventually hand her what respect couldn't. But homes don't belong to those who want them most. They belong to those who built them, paid for them, and signed their names on the line. And mine was still right there, clear as the day I wrote it. The change didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly, like rot spreading through wood, quiet but certain. The first signs were small enough to ignore. She stopped knocking before entering my room, brushing it off with a laugh, saying, "Oh, I forgot you were in there." Then she started moving my things, not just to clean, but to replace. The photo of my late husband that used to sit on the mantel disappeared one day, replaced with a scented candle she said matched the theme. My favorite chair, the one I'd sat in for years, was moved to the corner because, as she put it, it blocks the view. She said it like I was the obstruction, not the furniture. I didn't argue. I'd learned that arguments with people like her only confirm their power. She wanted me defensive, small, grateful. I gave her silence instead. Meals became her stage. I used to cook every night. It was the one thing I still enjoyed. But soon she began insisting on modern meals and told me gently but firmly that I should rest more. She said it with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. My cooking became too heavy, my habits too old-fashioned. So I stepped back, watching as she replaced home-cooked warmth with takeout boxes and delivery bags. My son pretended not to notice the shift. He'd sit at the table, scrolling on his phone, laughing at something she said, as if the woman who raised him wasn't sitting 2 chairs away, invisible. Then came the comments. Small, careless remarks disguised as jokes. "Don't worry, I'll remind you," she'd say, when I forgot something small, like where I'd put my glasses. "You know how it is when you get older." She laughed, my son laughed, and I just smiled, even though every word landed like a pin to the heart. She'd make them in front of guests too. Friends of hers, younger couples, the kind who looked at me like I was an antique that needed dusting. Once she even said, "We're thinking of updating the guest room." Or, well, her room. Her room. I caught the way she corrected herself. The embarrassment didn't come from what she said, but from how comfortable she was saying it. My son's silence bothered me more than her words. He never stopped her, never looked at me with even a hint of discomfort when she disrespected me in my own home. He acted like peace meant pretending not to see the problem. But peace without respect is just quiet cruelty. I realized then that he wasn't protecting me. He was protecting his convenience. Arguing with her would mean conflict, and conflict would mean effort. So he chose to stay still. That was his mistake. One evening, I overheard her talking on the phone to her mother. She said, "It's not like she'll be around much longer. We just need to wait it out." The words froze me in place. I stood in the hallway, holding a cup of tea that suddenly felt too heavy to lift. I didn't move. I just listened. Her mother said something I couldn't hear, and then she laughed. That light, dismissive laugh I'd grown used to. That night I didn't sleep. Not because I was angry, but because I was thinking. I'd given them kindness, space, trust, and they'd mistaken it all for weakness. The next morning, she greeted me cheerfully, as if nothing had happened. She poured herself coffee and asked if I wanted to join them on their upcoming vacation. I smiled. "No," I said. "You two go ahead and enjoy yourselves. I'll take care of the house." She thanked me, kissed my cheek, and walked away. That was the moment I decided. If she thought I was waiting to fade away, she was about to learn that I was still very much alive and capable. People like her never see it coming when the quiet ones make their move. Respect doesn't beg, it reclaims. The next morning began early. I woke before the sun, got dressed, and sat at the kitchen table with the folder I had kept for years. Inside were documents, the deed, the property tax receipts, the maintenance contracts, and every paper proving ownership. I went through each one carefully, checking dates and signatures, making sure nothing was missing. Every line reminded me of what I had built, what I had maintained, and what they had taken for granted. By the time the clock struck 9, I was ready. I placed the folder in my bag and left for the lawyer's office. The walk to the car felt heavier than usual, not because of age, but because of everything that moment represented. It wasn't revenge I was walking toward, it was correction. The lawyer had known me for many years. He handled the sale of the house decades ago when my husband and I first bought it. When I sat down across from his desk, he looked up from his computer and smiled in recognition. I didn't return it, I just placed the folder in front of him. He opened it, looked through the papers, and asked what I wanted to do. I told him directly, no hesitation, no explanation. The ownership needed to be adjusted, the authority restored, and the occupants redefined. I wasn't transferring anything new, I was simply reinstating what had always been mine. He nodded slowly, understanding more than my words. He prepared the documents within the hour. A few pages, a few signatures, a few stamps. That was all it took. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper was steady. I had spent a lifetime being quiet, holding peace, accepting small humiliations for the sake of family. That sound was the opposite of silence. It was the sound of closure. When it was done, he pushed the file toward me, and I placed my name at the bottom one last time. Everything that had been shared was now mine again, legally, officially, permanently. The process was faster than I expected. The new deed would be filed the same day, and the copies would arrive by mail. I thanked him, not because I needed to be polite, but because he had handled it cleanly, without unnecessary words. There was no emotion in his tone, no judgment in his eyes, just the completion of business. When I left his office, the world felt quiet in a different way, not empty, but peaceful, the kind of peace that follows decision. On the drive home, I stopped by the hardware store, a simple errand, unnoticed by anyone. I picked up new locks, extra keys, and a small box for storage. Nothing dramatic, just practical steps for what came next. The cashier asked if I wanted help carrying them. I said no. I carried everything myself. I'd carried heavier things before: disappointment, disrespect, silence. This was light in comparison. At home, I placed the documents in the drawer beside my bed. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I just sat quietly in my chair and let the feelings sink in. For years, they had lived under the illusion that this home belonged to them. Now, the truth was written and sealed. No arguments, no shouting, no scenes. Just ink on paper, cold, permanent, unquestionable. Later that evening, I heard them laughing downstairs, packing for their trip, planning days of comfort funded by the same house they no longer owned. I listened without emotion. There was no satisfaction, only certainty. Actions have meaning when they're final. I had signed mine. I didn't tell them anything. There was no need to. Lessons delivered quietly always last the longest. That night, before going to bed, I walked through the house. Every room looked the same, but something had changed. The air felt lighter. The walls, once heavy with tension, seemed to breathe again. Ownership wasn't just about paperwork. It was about reclaiming dignity, piece by piece, without apology. The document in the drawer was more than a legal statement. It was a reminder that silence doesn't mean surrender. It means waiting until the right moment to act, and then acting without warning. They left that Saturday morning for their trip. The car was packed full of suitcases, boxes, and the noise of their laughter. They moved around the house without awareness, confident, unbothered, sure that nothing could ever shift beneath them. She reminded me to water her plants and keep an eye on her delivery packages. She walked through the house, giving small instructions as if I were the housekeeper, not the owner. I nodded, followed her words with silence, and kept my expression even. Every instruction she gave was another confirmation that the lesson was necessary. They had built their comfort on my patience, and that patience had reached its final day. The front door closed behind them. The sound was sharp and final. Their car rolled out of the driveway, and for the first time in months, the house was quiet. No footsteps moving above my head, no voices in the kitchen, no lights left on in rooms I never used. Just stillness. I sat in the living room and let it settle. The air felt cleaner. The house didn't feel angry, it felt relieved. I walked through each room, touching the walls, the furniture, the photos. Every object carried memory. Decades of work, loss, and rebuilding. I thought about how easily they had tried to erase all of it by pretending it belonged to them. They had forgotten who paid the price for this peace. They had mistaken generosity for surrender. That afternoon, I took out the envelope from my drawer. Inside were the documents from the lawyer, the deed restored, the ownership redefined. I read every line again carefully. My name stood alone, clear and final. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like balance. I placed the papers back into the envelope and locked it away. Then I opened the small box I had brought from the hardware store and removed the new locks. One by one, I replaced every door in the house, the front, the back, the garage, and even the side entrance. The sound of the screwdriver turning was steady, rhythmic, almost peaceful. By the time the sun set, every lock was new, every key was mine. The next 2 days passed quietly. I went about my normal routine: breakfast at 7, a walk in the garden, reading in the afternoon. I watered her plants as promised and set them on the porch where the sunlight reached just enough. I didn't hate her. Hate takes energy, and I was done giving them mine. I simply made space for their absence before they even knew they were gone. It was a small but deliberate act of reclaiming. The house felt different now. It didn't hum with tension. It felt like it had been waiting for this correction. I took time to clean, room by room. I folded their blankets, stacked their dishes, and gathered their extra belongings into neat boxes. No anger, no revenge, just order. Everything they had left behind was part of the same mistake they had been living in, assuming permanence in a place that was borrowed. When I was done, I stood in the center of the hallway and took a deep breath. The silence didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. The night before they returned, I made one final check. The locks were secure, the keys in a drawer. The spare keys, the ones they used to keep, were gone, replaced quietly days ago. The papers were filed, notarized, legally sealed. There was nothing left for them to argue over. The house was mine again, not because of emotion, but because of fact. I slept soundly that night, the kind of sleep that comes only when things are finally set right. Morning came with the sound of birds outside and sunlight streaming through the window. I brewed my coffee and sat at the table by the window, watching the street. The same driveway they'd driven out of days ago would soon remind them where they stood. Their absence had given me peace. Their return would give them truth. Everything was in place, quiet, prepared, irreversible. By Tuesday, everything was complete. The legal transfer had been filed, the deed re-registered under my name only, and the bank records updated to reflect the change. The letter from the lawyer arrived in the morning mail, confirming that all formalities were done. I read it carefully, folded it neatly, and placed it back in the drawer beside my bed. The process had been quiet, clean, and efficient. No disputes, no confrontations, just paperwork doing what words could not. I had taken back what was mine, without a single raised voice. Ownership wasn't a discussion anymore. It was a documented fact. The locksmith arrived that afternoon to finish securing the back door. He was polite, quick, and professional. He asked if I'd lost my old keys, and I simply said, "It's time for an update." He nodded, changed the locks, and handed me a small sealed bag containing 3 identical keys. One for my purse, one for the kitchen drawer, one for safekeeping. I paid him in cash and thanked him as he left. No one would notice the difference from the outside. Same house, same doors. But everything beyond that threshold had changed completely. Once he was gone, I stood in the front hallway, turning one of the new keys in my hand. It was small, plain, and ordinary, but it held everything they had forgotten: responsibility, authority, and the quiet kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself. I locked the door, unlocked it again, then locked it once more. The sound was crisp, final, satisfying. It wasn't about keeping people out. It was about setting boundaries that should have existed long ago. The next step was simple but symbolic. I walked through each room of the house, removing small things that no longer belonged. Her perfume bottles on the dresser, her magazines stacked in the living room, her decorative cushions in my chair, all gathered neatly into boxes and set aside, not out of spite, but out of restoration. The house looked more like itself again. It wasn't cluttered with her presence or filled with her scent. It was calm, still, mine. I dusted the shelves, rearranged the photos, and let the air clear. When evening came, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the neighborhood lights flicker on. No one passing by would have guessed that the entire dynamic of this household had shifted in less than a week. People assume power always comes with noise. They forget that the quietest actions often leave the deepest marks. The paper I signed at that lawyer's office carried more weight than any argument I could have had with them. In a few sentences, with a single signature, everything they had assumed was theirs had returned to its rightful place. The sense of peace that came after was strange. I didn't feel triumphant or smug. I just felt level, balanced again, like a table that had been uneven for too long. Years of silent tolerance had finally settled into stillness. I spent the next few days tending to my garden, reading and sleeping through the night without the sound of slammed doors or late-night arguments echoing down the hall. The locks gleamed under the porch light when I looked at them that night. The small brass key rested in my palm, smooth and cool. Control doesn't have to be loud. It can exist quietly in a drawer, in an envelope, or on a key ring. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without someone else's voice pressing against my peace. Every choice had been deliberate. No rush, no emotion, just precision. The deed had been rewritten, the access revoked, the order restored. I didn't need revenge. I needed quiet, and now I had it. The change wasn't visible from the street, but inside the walls it was absolute. Nothing in this house belonged to anyone but me. They came back on a Friday evening. The sound of the car pulling into the driveway was sharp and restless, the kind of sound made by people returning to comfort they took for granted. I stayed inside, sitting near the window with my cup of tea cooling in my hand. The headlights cut across the walls, the doors of the car opened, and their voices filled the air. Laughter first, then muffled conversation, then the metallic rattle of keys. The first twist in the lock made a hollow sound, a resistance they didn't expect. Another try, harder this time. The same result. Silence followed, then confusion, then panic. I watched their movements through the glass, the way her hand trembled slightly, the way he kept checking the key as if it might suddenly explain itself. The house stood still, calm, unbothered. The locks didn't open, the doors didn't move, and every mistake they had made now stood quietly between them and entry. They tried the side door next, then the back. Each click of failure sounded the same. It was almost rhythmic, like the sound of understanding settling in. The woman spoke fast, gesturing toward the windows, checking her phone, pacing back and forth. My son stood still longer than she did, staring at the door like it might open out of pity. He didn't call my name, didn't knock. He knew. Even before seeing me, he knew something had shifted. The same silence he once used to avoid defending me now pressed against him from the other side of the door. The moment stretched on until she tried again, this time with frustration, pushing against the handle as though effort could undo consequence. The key refused to fit. It wasn't the same key anymore. Inside, the house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock. I didn't move. I didn't rush to the door or pretend to be surprised. There was no need for performance. The lesson had already been written in metal and wood. Eventually, I stood up and walked to the hallway, slow and steady. Through the glass panels beside the door, I saw their faces clearly now. Disbelief, anger, confusion, realization. My son's expression wasn't of betrayal, but of recognition. He knew exactly whose decision this was. The woman's eyes darted around, looking for sympathy, for logic, for someone to blame. There was no one left but the reflection staring back at her. I unlocked the door halfway, enough to make a point, not enough to welcome them in. I looked at them without words, and for a moment, no one spoke. The silence said everything that needed saying. It was the kind of silence that comes after years of ignoring warnings, the kind that follows every quiet insult, every small humiliation, every unspoken boundary crossed. They understood without explanation. The woman's shoulders dropped. My son's eyes lowered. The air between us felt heavy but clear. I didn't need to remind them of what they'd said or done. The house itself carried the memory. They stood outside for a long time after that. I closed the door slowly, turned the new key in the lock, and walked away. Through the window, I saw them still standing on the porch as the evening light faded. She cried, not loudly, not dramatically, but the quiet kind that comes when realization hits too late. My son didn't comfort her. He just stared at the ground, his hand holding a key that no longer belonged to him. The same house that once opened without question now stood solid against them, unyielding, indifferent. The night grew darker. The sound of their voices faded. Eventually, the car engine started again, hesitating once before driving off down the street. The taillights disappeared at the corner, leaving nothing but the hum of the streetlights and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. I stood at the window for a while longer, then turned off the lights and went to bed. No anger, no victory, just stillness. They had finally learned the meaning of permanence, not the kind that comes from words, but from the quiet authority of consequence. The next morning, the street outside was empty. The car that had carried their laughter and panic the night before was gone. The porch was quiet except for the faint mark of their footsteps in the dust near the door. I sat at the table by the window with my coffee, watching the sunlight move slowly across the floor. The house felt calm, unbothered by what had happened. There was no guilt, no conflict, only order restored. Every corner of the house seemed to breathe again, free from tension and unspoken resentment. The rooms that once echoed with sharp voices now carried silence that felt clean. What had begun as correction now existed as balance. Later that morning, the phone began to ring. It rang once, twice, then a pause, then again. I didn't move to answer it. The sound was steady, but I let it continue until it stopped. The machine clicked, and the message recorded itself. A voice followed, strained, shaken, trying to sound composed. Words about confusion, about misunderstanding, about needing to talk. I listened until the end, then erased it. There was nothing left to discuss. Words had already done enough harm. Actions had corrected them. Silence didn't need justification. The mail arrived shortly after. Among the envelopes was one from the lawyer. It contained the final confirmation of property transfer, stamped, dated, and sealed. I held it for a while, reading the official language that made everything permanent. It was an ordinary letter to anyone else, but to me it was proof that patience, when paired with precision, holds more strength than anger ever could. I placed the document in my desk drawer with the others, organized and untouched. Everything was in order, legally, financially, emotionally. By afternoon, I went outside to water the garden. The air was warm, the soil dry. The plants leaned toward the light like nothing in the world had changed. I worked slowly, watering each one, trimming the overgrown leaves, sweeping the pathway clear. Every action felt steady, necessary, and deliberate. The small tasks of living are what restore balance after years of being overlooked. As I moved, I thought about how quickly arrogance can dissolve when it meets structure. My daughter-in-law had built her comfort on borrowed walls. She had forgotten that generosity has limits and patience has terms. The locks, the papers, the silence. Each of them had been reminders written without words. Toward evening, the sun began to set behind the line of trees near the gate. The light fell through the window, filling the living room with gold. I stood there watching it stretch across the floor, touching the furniture, the photographs, the walls. Everything in that house existed because of work, endurance, and memory. Things that couldn't be erased by someone else's carelessness. She had thought control came from possession, but real control comes from understanding where everything begins. She hadn't built this home. She had only lived in the shadow of someone who did. That night I received another call. This time I picked it up. There was no apology, no anger, just confusion. I listened, quiet as always. The voice on the other end sounded smaller than before, less certain, less proud. The tone that once spoke with dismissal now trembled under the weight of consequence. I said nothing, and silence filled the line. When it became clear that I wouldn't offer comfort, the voice faded into a whisper, and then the line went dead. I placed the phone down and went back to my chair by the window. Outside, the world was still. When I finally turned off the lights and went to bed, the air inside the house felt right again. It wasn't victory I felt, just relief. Boundaries, once ignored, had been redrawn. The same woman who had once spoken with entitlement now carried the memory of that locked door everywhere she went. There would be no more jokes about forever or quiet dismissals in hallways. Forever had ended the moment the key didn't turn. Days passed quietly after that. The phone stopped ringing, the door stayed still, and the peace that settled through the house felt complete. The silence no longer carried weight. It carried comfort. The morning routines returned to what they once were. Tea at dawn, light cleaning, the radio playing softly in the background. Each day felt like a small restoration of dignity. No one knocked at the door. No one called to question, complain, or argue. It was as if the world outside had finally learned its place. The walls no longer felt heavy with tension or unspoken resentment. They simply held the calm of a life reclaimed. My son came by once, midweek. He parked his car quietly by the curb, not in the driveway where he used to pull up carelessly. His posture was different, slower, smaller. He didn't bring her with him. He stood at the gate for a few minutes before coming closer. I didn't rush to open the door. I let him wait. Time, after all, teaches best when silence holds it still. When I finally stepped outside, he tried to speak, but the words struggled to form. He looked tired, older, not from years but from realization. He carried the kind of guilt that doesn't shout. It lingers in posture and tone. There were no explanations offered, and I didn't ask for any. Some things didn't need revisiting. They had already played out exactly as they were meant to. He left after a few minutes, saying he would come again. He never did. The quiet after his departure was lighter than before. I knew then that whatever conversation he wanted to have would never be spoken. The truth didn't need repeating. It was written in every locked door and empty room. Sometimes consequences end relationships quietly, not in anger, but in final understanding. I didn't need to see him again to know that he understood. The following weeks passed peacefully. I tended to the garden, cooked simple meals, and read old books I hadn't touched in years. The rhythm of solitude suited me. The house had become my own again, not just in name but in spirit. Every sound inside belonged to me. The click of the clock, the creak of the floor, the rustle of curtains when the wind passed through. It felt alive again, not crowded, not tense, but calm. I began noticing small details I'd ignored before, the way the morning light hit the kitchen counter, the smell of old wood warming in the sun, the way rain sounded on the roof when the storms came. It was peace without apology. News came through neighbors, quietly, politely. They had moved into a smaller place across town, something they could manage on their own. The tone in their voices carried discomfort, the kind people use when sharing news they think might sting. It didn't. There was no satisfaction, no joy in hearing it, just confirmation that life had arranged itself as it should. I didn't wish them harm. I didn't wish them well either. I wished them lessons, the kind that time doesn't erase. Every decision carries a cost, and they were now paying theirs in monthly installments called rent. Occasionally, I'd see their car pass by the street, never stopping, never slowing, just driving past like a shadow of what once tried to take up space. I'd watch from the window, not with bitterness, but with calm observation. Distance had a way of fixing things that words never could. The house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a boundary honored. Evenings were the best part of the day. I'd sit outside with my tea and watch the sky change color. The light would fade, the streetlights would hum on, and the world would settle into quiet. No arguments, no tension, no pretending. Just stillness. The kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from ending something properly. They had wanted control. I had chosen closure, and closure always comes with calm. When I locked the doors each night, I didn't do it out of fear. I did it out of certainty. Every turn of the key reminded me that some things, once corrected, never need to be revisited. The house stood strong, unchanged, unbothered, exactly as it should. The world outside had adjusted to its lesson. I had too. Even months later, the calm never broke. The days came and went without disruption, each one simple and quiet, each one proof that the decision had been right. There were no more footsteps rushing through the hallway, no voices layered with irritation, no tension hovering above every meal. The house returned to rhythm, slow but steady. It no longer felt like something I was clinging to. It felt like something that belonged entirely to me again. The weight of their presence had been replaced with peace, and peace had a sound of its own, a steady silence that stayed loyal. Every morning when I turned the key in the lock, I felt the quiet satisfaction of control. Not control over others, but over my own life. The key was small, plain, ordinary, yet it represented something no one could take back: independence. It wasn't about ownership of walls or land. It was about reclaiming the respect that had been taken for granted. I had given, tolerated, and compromised for years, believing that love excused disregard. But time teaches differently. It shows that when kindness isn't valued, boundaries must speak louder than emotion. And they did. The world outside kept moving. New families moved into neighboring homes, seasons changed, and people went about their lives unaware that inside this house, a quiet victory had been sealed in silence. The garden bloomed stronger that year, the soil richer than before, the colors brighter. Even nature seemed to recognize balance when it returned. I spent my afternoons there, trimming, planting, watering, all without interruption. Every root I touched reminded me that strength doesn't come from holding on. It comes from knowing when to let go. My son wrote once, a short letter, simple words about regret and misunderstanding. I read it fully, then folded it and placed it in a box with the others. Letters, papers, old photographs, small pieces of history that once meant something. I didn't reply. Some answers are better left written in actions rather than words. He knew where things stood. Regret can't reopen locked doors. The woman who had once said I couldn't live there forever had found her own version of temporary peace somewhere else. I imagined her routine now: smaller rooms, tighter budgets, and a constant reminder that words carry weight when spoken from arrogance. She had learned that forever is a fragile thing when built on someone else's patience. I didn't hate her. There was no space left for hate, only understanding, the kind that comes when consequences have finished their work. Life inside the house continued smoothly, bills paid, rooms clean, doors secure. I moved through each day without second-guessing myself. I had once been made to feel like an unwanted guest in my own home. Now I was its only resident, its keeper, its calm center. The loneliness others might imagine never came. Solitude has a dignity that company often destroys. It wasn't silence I feared. It was disrespect disguised as love, and that was gone for good. At night I would sit in the same chair by the window, the one where I'd first heard that sentence that started it all. The hallway where she'd whispered those words now stood empty, washed in soft lamplight. I would look out at the garden, the path, the front gate, all still and perfectly mine. The peace wasn't grand or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, earned. I didn't need applause or validation. The satisfaction came from knowing I had chosen the right kind of ending, one written not in anger but in authority. She had said I couldn't live there forever. She was right, in her way, because now she couldn't either. The house had no room for arrogance anymore. It had space only for truth, ownership, and quiet strength. One paper, one lock, one lesson. That was all it took to rewrite everything. And when I finally turned off the lights at night, I did it without hesitation, knowing that peace, once restored, doesn't ask for permission to stay.